When an avoidant sees you again after a long silence, the first thing that happens is not emotional reflection, not nostalgia, not even regret in the way most people understand it. What happens first is something far more primitive and far more revealing. They scan you, not casually, not consciously. They scan you the way a nervous system scans a threat. And that's important to understand, because if you misinterpret this moment as curiosity or indifference, you completely miss the psychological drama unfolding underneath the surface. Avoidants regulate closeness through distance. That's their core survival strategy. Intimacy for them is not safety, it's exposure. And silence is not absence, it's regulation. So when you reappear after a long silence, their system doesn't ask, do I still care about this person? It asks a more urgent question. Do they still have emotional access to me? Or worse, do I still have emotional access to them? Because access is power. And power in this context is safety without vulnerability. This is why their attention immediately locks onto subtle cues. Your posture, your eye contact, your tone. Whether you seem anxious, open, warm, tentative, or grounded, contained, and self-directed, they are unconsciously searching for the old emotional entry point, the place where they once knew they could retreat and still be held. If they sense that you are still emotionally available in the same way, their nervous system relaxes, not because they want closeness, but because the environment feels predictable again. But if something has shifted, if you're calmer, slower, less reactive, less eager, then something destabilizing happens. The avoidant experience is a quiet form of threat because now distance no longer guarantees control. Silence no longer belongs exclusively to them. That is deeply unsettling. You see, avoidants are not indifferent people. They are hyper-aware people who learned early that emotional dependence comes at a cost. So they developed a strategy: stay composed, stay self-contained, and never need too much. But that strategy only works if the other person continues to supply emotional openness. When that supply disappears, the avoidant is forced to confront something they work very hard to avoid: mutuality. This is why the scanning is so intense. They are looking for signs that the old dynamic still exists. Will you lean in emotionally? Will you fill the silence? Will you soften first? Will you reopen the door they closed? These are not manipulative calculations in the villainous sense. They are defensive reflexes shaped by years, sometimes decades of emotional conditioning. And here's the paradox: the more emotionally stable and self-contained you appear, the more activated the avoidant becomes internally. Not outwardly, of course. Outwardly, they may look calm, detached, even slightly bored, but internally something fractures because your independence forces them into a psychological corner. Either accept that they no longer control the distance or risk losing the connection entirely. This is where philosophy enters the picture. Human beings are not distressed by loss alone. We are distressed by loss of meaning. And when you no longer organize your emotional life around them, the avoidant loses a role they never consciously admitted they were playing. The one who could leave without consequence. The one who could disappear and return unchanged. When that role collapses, they are left staring at themselves. And that's the moment they fear most. So when you see that intense look, that subtle assessment, that pause, before they speak, understand what it is. It is not coldness. It is not lack of feeling. It is a system recalibrating under pressure. They are trying to determine whether the old rules still apply, whether silence still protects them, whether you are still reachable without risk. And this is where your power lies. Not in confrontation, not in explanation, not in emotional display, but in coherence. When you are aligned internally, when your behavior matches your boundaries, you remove the avoidance ability to hide behind ambiguity. You become a mirror they cannot distort. Because the truth is this: the moment they realize they can no longer access you without vulnerability is the moment the dynamic changes forever. And that realization, quiet, internal, undeniable, is where real psychological consequences begin. After that initial internal scan, after they've quietly assessed whether the old emotional access still exists, the avoidant almost always does something that confuses people. They act normal, sometimes overly normal, polite, casual, calm, maybe even warm in a restrained, socially appropriate way. And if you don't understand the psychology behind this, you'll misread it entirely. You'll think they're fine, they've moved on, this meant nothing. But that interpretation misses the point. What you're witnessing is not comfort, it's armor. Avoidants don't neutralize emotional threat by addressing it. They neutralize it by flattening it. Normally is their shield. If everything feels ordinary, then nothing has to be felt deeply. If the conversation stays light, then nothing dangerous can surface. So they speak about safe topics, everyday events, work, neutral observations. They may smile, they may joke, they may even appear confident. But this composure is not ease, it's containment. Psychologically, this is emotional suppression mascara. Ding is maturity. And here's the critical distinction. Suppression is not resolution. Suppression is pressure held beneath the surface. The avoidant believes that if they don't name the emotional weight, it will eventually dissolve. But unprocessed emotion doesn't disappear. It waits. And the longer it waits, the more force it accumulates. This is why their normal behavior is so strategic, though again, mostly unconscious. They are testing the environment. Will you disrupt the calm by bringing up what was left unresolved? Will you ask for clarity? Will you express hurt, longing, or confusion? If you do, the avoidance nervous system interprets that as confirmation. Intimacy equals instability. And they retreat, not because they don't care, but because their internal alarm has been triggered. But here's the reversal most people don't see. If you don't break the calm, if you don't chase emotional closure, don't press for reassurance, don't reopen the wound, something unexpected happens. The avoidant sense of control begins to erode because the calm they rely on depends on the other person being emotionally expressive. When you remain grounded and self-contained, their strategy loses its counterbalance. This is deeply uncomfortable for them. Silence. Once their refuge becomes ambiguous, normally once their shield starts to feel thin, they begin to wonder what you're feeling. Not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because uncertainty creeps in. And uncertainty is far more destabilizing to an avoidant than conflict. Philosophically speaking, human beings seek order. We organize ourselves around predictable roles. The avoidance role has long been the composed one. The one who doesn't need, doesn't chase, doesn't fall apart. But that role only works in contrast to someone who does. When you no longer play the emotionally available counterpart, the structure collapses. And when structure collapses, anxiety rushes in. So there normally becomes exaggerated. They might lean harder into politeness, humor, or emotional neutrality. They might emphasize how fine they are, how busy, how unbothered. This isn't indifference, it's self-soothing. They're trying to convince themselves that nothing meaningful is at stake, but the very effort reveals the opposite. This is also why avoidants often appear emotionally delayed. The feelings don't hit in the moment. They arrive later in private when the armor comes off. That's when the questions surface. That's when regret, curiosity, and longing sneak in. But by then, the dynamic may have already shifted beyond their control. And here's the crucial insight for you. The goal is not to outplay the avoidant. It's to outgrow the dynamic. When you don't rush to fill emotional space, when you allow normally without clinging to it, you demonstrate something profoundly unsettling to an avoidant. That connection is no longer something they alone regulate because real strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand IT, doesn't explain itself. It remains steady in the presence of ambiguity. And when normally stops working as armor, the avoidant is left face to face with the truth they've been avoiding all along. Emotional depth doesn't disappear just because you refuse to look at it. Once the surface calm has been established, once the scanning has finished and the performance of normally is in place, the avoidance attention shifts to something far more subtle and far more decisive. They begin watching for power shifts, not power in the crude sense of dominance or manipulation, but psychological power, who holds the emotional center of gravity, who is anchored, who is orbiting. Because in any relationship, especially one marked by distance and return, that center matters more than affection, more than history, and often more than intention. Avoidants are exquisitely sensitive to this because their sense of safety depends on asymmetry. They feel most secure when they can approach or withdraw without consequence. That freedom becomes part of their identity. So when they see you again after a long silence, they're not primarily asking, do I still love this person? They're asking, do I still matter to this person in the same way? And beneath that question is an even more unsettling one. Do they still need me? They watch how you speak, whether your words are measured or rushed, whether you explain yourself unnecessarily, whether you seek acknowledgement or validation. They notice how quiet you respond, how easy, why you laugh, how much emotional space you offer. These are not romantic observations. They are diagnostic. The avoidant is reading the room to determine whether the old hierarchy is intact. If they sense that you are still emotionally oriented toward them, still subtly adjusting yourself around their presence, their nervous system settles. The world feels ordered again. They may not lean in, but they feel reassured because the emotional gravity remains where it always was, centered on them. They can stay distant and still be significant, but if they sense something else, something quieter but more powerful, everything changes. If you are composed without being closed, present without being eager, open without being exposed, the avoidant feels a strange and destabilizing loss. Not loss of you necessarily, but loss of position. The relationship no longer revolves around their comfort, and that is deeply disorienting. This is where confusion begins to surface. They may not show it, but internally the ground shifts because emotional independence in another person forces the avoidant into a moral confrontation. Either step forward into mutuality or risk becoming irrelevant. And both options are frightening in different ways. Mutuality demands vulnerability. Irrelevance threatens identity. This is why avoidants often re-engage at precisely the moment they feel least needed. Not with grand gestures, not with confession, but with subtle probes, a message, a comment, a moment of unexpected warmth. These are not expressions of love in the conventional sense. They are attempts to reestablish orientation to see whether they can still influence the emotional field. Philosophically, this touches something ancient. Human beings fear meaninglessness more than pain. And when you no longer derive your emotional meaning from their presence, the avoidant confronts the possibility that their withdrawal no longer defines the relationship. They are no longer the axis around which things turn. And that realization is quietly devastating. What's important to understand is that this is not about punishment or revenge. You are not winning by becoming independent. You are simply becoming whole. And wholeness disrupts dysfunctional systems because those systems rely on imbalance to survive. The avoidant feels this as pressure. They may become restless, slightly irritated, or unexpectedly attentive. These are signs that the emotional economy has changed. And when economies change, people either adapt or withdraw. Here is where many people make a mistake. They see the avoidant's renewed attention and interpret it as resolution. It's not. It's a response to a shift in power, not a commitment to depth. If you rush to reassure them to restore the old imbalance, the system snaps back into place. But if you remain grounded, warm, but not orbiting, you force a new reality to emerge. And that reality is simple but profound connection without depth. Indents. Because when no one is chasing, when no one is fleeing, when both people stand on their own ground, something honest finally becomes possible. And that is the moment when an avoidant must choose, not between you and distance, but between fear and responsibility. After the scanning, after the performance of normally, after the quiet assessment of who holds the emotional center, the avoidant reaches a point where the internal pressure can no longer remain invisible. But here's the crucial thing to understand. They still do not move toward resolution in a direct way. They don't sit down and say, here's what I felt, here's what I did, here's what I'm afraid of. That would require emotional integration. And that is precisely what their nervous system resists. Instead, they do what they have always done best. They repress and then they retreat or they reattach indirectly. Repression comes first. The feelings that surface when they see you again, guilt, longing, regret, relief, fear, are immediately pushed down, not denied intellectually but muted somatically. They tell themselves a story. This isn't a big deal. I'm fine. Nothing needs to be addressed. And for a short time, that story works. They go back to their routines. They distract themselves. They maintain distance. From the outside, it can look like nothing changed at all, but repression is not strength. It's delayed reckoning, and what is delayed does not disappear. It compounds. So the avoidant reaches a fork in the road, usually without really zing it. One path is retreat. This looks like emotional withdrawal, reduced contact, sudden busyness, or a cooling that feels disproportionate to the interaction. This retreat is not punishment and not cruelty. It is a flight response. Your presence stirred something they cannot metabolize, so they increase distance to restore internal equilibrium. Distance once again becomes anesthesia. The other path is more confusing. Instead of retreating fully, they reattach, but indirectly. A message that says nothing and yet says something. A check-in that lacks depth. A reaction to your social media, a moment of warmth followed by silence. He-say gestures are not accidents. They are attempts to stay connected without stepping into vulnerability, to touch the wire without taking the shock. This is where many people lose their footing. Indirect reattachment feels like hope. It feels like progress. But psychologically, it is neither. It is an avoidant trying to regulate their anxiety while keeping the emotional door half open and half closed. Close enough to reduce the fear of loss, far enough to avoid the fear of intimacy, and beneath both retreat and indirect reattachment lies the same unresolved conflict. They cannot reconcile closeness with safety. From a philosophical standpoint, this is a failure of integration. The avoidant has split their emotional life into compartments. Connection here, autonomy there, longing over here, fear over